Welcome to the Ancestral Cure podcast. I'm your host, Julian, and I'm here to guide you through the fascinating realm of holistic health. Join us as we bridge ancient wisdom with modern science to help you achieve optimal health, reclaim your vitality, and unlock your body's true potential. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Ancestral Cure podcast. Today, I've got a very special guest. He is a mentor, an educator, a health coach, and he's also someone I've been following for about 9 months now. Just an incredible source of knowledge. Jack, how are you?
Doing well, man. How are you?
I'm all right, yeah. It's an absolute privilege to have you on. Because I've followed you for like a long time now, and just the amount of knowledge you've built up and the amount of research you've done, the way that you work with clients on an individual basis, it's really inspired me to um, work towards my goals of taking on clients and dealing with people's health issues. So yeah, it's really inspiring to have you on.
Well, it's great to be here, man. I know that you've been a follower of my work and a school member, and as I said before we started the recording, you asked some really insightful questions in there, and I always remember the people that ask the
Mm.
great questions that I know that are thinking outside the box, and those are the people that I like to speak to be honest with you. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. I hope you have some good questions for me, and as I said, just don't hold back on anything.
Perfect. So yeah, why don't you introduce us to your background, your story? How did you sort of get into this whole realm of health, holistic health, health coaching? So yeah, what's the story?
So the story is, and I'll try and keep it somewhat as short as possible, but the story is essentially, I'd say I was health conscious throughout my whole life, but in saying that, I'd go to extremes where I'd be extreme around exercise or something like that, but then I'd have something else that I'd go extreme with, and that'd predominantly be like video games, junk food, drugs and alcohol, and so on and so forth, and it would come in waves. And I think around COVID time was when I really started to notice my health issues declining, I would say. Definitely around like low testosterone. I've shared that quite a bit now, and you can even see it on my website on the first page is just my testosterone was equivalent to an average of a 70-year-old man. So pretty average, to be honest with you, in terms of how I felt. And it wasn't just that, but there was a lot of other things going on, I would say, like around issues in the gut, unresolved stress, anxiety, trauma. And then whilst all this was happening, and on top of that, like sleep issues that I should add, whilst all this was happening, this was all during COVID, during the pandemic. So there was a synergism of me waking up to what's going on in the centralized system and how fucking backwards it is. And I went through that firsthand with the experiences I had with endocrinologists, general practitioners, and other doctors in the space that I just went and saw locally in Australia. And then I suppose the other thing that was going on was the pandemic. And I think a lot of people opened their eyes to how fucked up everything is, to be honest with you, and how backwards the whole system is, and how much we just got misled around that whole scenario. And those two synergizing together made me realize, okay, well, yeah, there is more to this story around my health. It's not just like an answer of medication, band-aid fixes. I wanted to get to the root causes. I'm not sure what stimulated that in me. I think it was like a few instances, but one of the ones that really drew to me was my endocrinologist. I asked him, he was, by the way, he was fat, he was bald. It was like not what you'd expect someone who should be like a hormone doctor to be, but unfortunately they are. And I remember I asked him, does stress, does how, like nutrition, does exercise, does sleep have much to do with what's going on with my hormones being literally below the reference range, like conventionally speaking? And he said to me, not really. And I think that's what really made me think, okay, there's more to this story. And I just did my own research. I found a few people online. As we spoke about, like prior to this conversation, when you recorded that, I also went through a few hoops of like diets and things of that nature as well. Carnivore diet, keto, even vegan, I think. There was just a bunch of things that I tried. And I think essentially what it was I was trying to find an external source to blame for other things that I didn't want to take responsibility for. And I was just hoping that, that was just going to resolve it and I could continue to live my life where I'd, consume drugs and alcohol endlessly on weekends and stay up late and, just do really bad things to my biology, basically. Um, and it wasn't until I suppose I just did a bit of experimentation on myself and learnt about things deeper than what the fucking food pyramid and what my doctors told me is that, yeah, there's more to this story. And I would say like 6 months or so after that is when I really started to move the needle around certain things and starting to take responsibility for those things that I mentioned before that I didn't want to take responsibility for. And I stopped pointing fingers at like, okay, it's the carnivore diet that's going to save me or this or that. But no, it's like absolutely everything that I needed to address. And fortunately, I was able to reverse a lot of my health issues, which was amazing. And that motivated me to help others. So my old job, I was an electrical linesman, which for those who don't know, like I'd work on power lines. So doing that job, I definitely like I would say like it does relate to what I do now because we can think of the body electrically, and I think that's really important in terms of tying in with what's going on with the biophysics of energy and things of that nature down the line. And I essentially as I said, I wanted to help people, and then I was studying, and like whilst I was working, I was just studying. It became like this thing that it felt like my purpose really, and I was just indulging into as much research, just learning constantly. Like I lived and breathed, like just learning about my body biology, and as I said before, like what health truly encompasses, not like what we've been taught or misled to be thinking is what health is connected to. And flash forward a little bit further, I quit my job, maybe what was it, June in 2023, and ever since then I've been traveling. And I've kind of been a bit more stable now, but traveling, building up my business, and yeah, now it's become a bit more of a full-time thing. As you know, like mentoring, health coaching, got the school community, got a few other things going on. So it's been really nice and rewarding to be able to help people along different levels in terms of what kind of conditions they have. So yeah, and now I'm currently in the Philippines, which is very grounding, just on this island at the ninth latitude called Siquijor. And it seems like I'm going to probably be staying here long term, which has been quite nice since I've been living out of like a 8 kilogram backpack for the last 2 years, which has been an experience within itself. But yeah, that's me right now in terms of where I'm at. And yeah, I suppose, yeah, that's all I can really add for now, to be honest with you. But yeah, Philippines is very beautiful, strong sun, volcanoes nearby. It's just very grounding to be somewhere where I'm just submerged in nature.
Awesome. I mean, yeah, it's great to be somewhere tropical, like you're with, you've got lots of sunlight, lots of free electrons from waterfalls and whatever. So when you went to your endocrinologist, how long did it take him? How long did it take for him to prescribe you like some sort of medication?
So I feel very fortunate that he restricted initially because at that stage of my life, I was happy to take like I was happy to go to a therapist and get or a psychologist and get SSRIs. I was happy to go to an endocrinologist and get TRT because I didn't give a fuck about getting from A to B. I just wanted the easiest way to move that needle, despite, the side effects and collateral damage and the nuance around all of that, which I think that's going to be the majority of the population. Um, and he did give me, like pretty early on, he did give me something called letrozole, which is an aromatase inhibitor, which essentially raised my testosterone, but then tanked my estrogen. So in saying that, like I still felt like shit. And I think there's probably arguably other things beyond hormones that are going to be reflecting what's going on with my health. But in saying that, like it just goes to show that low estrogen isn't good either. And this has made me learn within that like hormones work in synergism and they work in balance and they need to be in the right ratios. And when you just take a random suicidal aromatase inhibitor, um, it's not the answer. So he gave me that pretty early on, to be honest with you, probably like within a month or two. And fortunately, that was the only medication I took. I could have potentially had the opportunity to take TRT, I'm sure, later down the line if things didn't resolve, but it didn't happen. And I'm actually really grateful for that because I think it would have just pushed me down into a deeper hole of reliance and not actually made me figure out that I had to take health into my own hands.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. When you sort of go from the centralized health system to the holistic realm, you realize that it's not about suppressing the symptoms, it's about addressing the root cause, the underlying root cause, because I mean, a lot of the times your symptoms are actually helping you. They're they're giving you a signal that something's dysregulated and you've got to fix it. Whereas if you're just masking it and you're suppressing it, like a band-aid approach, which is what the conventional system does, that's just not going to solve the issue long term, is it?
No, and I think Eastern medicine is very much all about prevention as opposed to treatment. And I think
Mm,
that's where we need to stick back to is prevention before any sort of symptoms start to manifest. And if there are symptoms that manifest, we listen. And I think your body can't talk to you, so it does express it in symptoms as well. So we need to look at it from like that energetic, spiritual level on top of what's going on, chemically speaking. And yeah, it's just completely backwards in terms of all that. I could go on for hours in terms of how backwards everything is around vaccinations, how we just hand out pharmaceuticals like candy, and then just not be aware of the side effects, or just, if there is a side effect, we just treat it with more medications to mask the symptoms. And we're not getting down to those root cause, that root cause. And I will say, I think root cause is a bit of a misnomer as well, because we could just be hunting for one root cause where realistically there could be multiple root causes at play, just because of the nuance that it's not just, never just one thing. And I like to use the example where stress and trauma within itself, like, could be a root cause, right? But if it starts to express with physical symptoms because of its interactions with neuroinflammation, which again, the nervous system essentially governs the rest of the body, or the gut brain axis and the vagus nerve and whatever else that connects to the central nervous system, then if we deal with that root cause, we're not dealing with the gut dysbiosis at play, or
mm.
the metabolic defects that we have due to stress, adrenal insufficiencies, whatever it is. Like, I think it's an approach where you have to look very broad spectrum. And I'm big on looking at just like symptoms deeply, lab work, environment, and health history. And we really have to, as coaches, practitioners, we really have to be a detective and dive in and have a really deep conversation with someone. And we just don't get that. Like, if I reflect back to when I spoke to my endocrinologist, it was literally just 5 minutes, and he had no fucking, he probably doesn't even know my fucking first name. Like, it's just to be able to decipher what someone fundamentally needs just of a 5 minute conversation. And again, this is just a system that's been made and what's in place because of what is going on, like, and how money is made, and like how it all funnels into big pharma and big tech and everything else. That it's not, just to circle back to what I said, because I forgot what you even said now, but I think it was about root causes. But it's just the whole system is completely backwards, and it should, to circle back, I think it's all about prevention and optimization as opposed to treatment. And some people are just too far gone, and that's okay. Look, some people won't ever wake up to it, and that's fine. And that's just how it's going to be, which is very frustrating for us with our loved ones, and family, where, you really want to tell them to fucking put their feet on the earth and see the sunrise, but they just don't listen, and they'd rather go for something in the drug cabinet. So yeah, just to circle back, I just think prevention is key. But with people and symptoms, like, just reflecting back on my story, that I had to fall down a certain amount of times to pick myself up, and that's just how it is. There's just no way around it. It's just like, from personal experiences, you can obviously push people in the right direction around what needs to be done and give them the breadcrumbs, but a lot of people just don't listen.
Yeah, it's just really frustrating, especially because with like centralized education, they sort of teach you all of these like individual concepts without actually linking it together. And perfect example, I had a lecture a few days ago where he was talking about how sunlight's required to make vitamin D. Like sunlight has to convert cholesterol into vitamin D. But then like if I'd said, well, does that mean sunscreen's bad because it blocks UV? Like he would have looked at me as if I were crazy. But that's like the logical conclusion that follows from what he was teaching. So it's like they teach all these individual concepts, but they'll never actually make the connection. That's because they're not allowed to. It's like it's a centralized system. Same with I had a biochemistry lecture talk about how well we learned in chemistry that like if you've got like a CC double bond, it's more reactive and more prone to oxidation. And in a different class in biochemistry, my lecturer said how like polyunsaturated fats have lots of double bonds, but they're never going to make that connection that like, oh, this means seed oils are bad because they're more reactive or toxic. Like it's everything's just isolated and there's no critical thought involved.
Yeah, and I think it also just comes down to, we got to remember people, like generalizing here, but a lot of people in the world are just not that healthy. And when you're not healthy, you're just not passionate about a lot of things. You don't have a purpose. You're just going through your 9 to 5 and just not thinking about anything else. They don't want to think outside the box. They just want to get their paycheck and get the fuck home. And, maybe spend those 2 days drinking piss or, just sitting on their fucking phones for 2 days and not really wanting to expand on their knowledge around these topics. And yeah, that's just how the system fundamentally is. Like it's pretty sad. And I think you're probably the same as me. You just wish more people were more passionate about what they had to say. But as I said, like it's just some people are just literally living day by day, running at about 30%. Whereas us, like we obviously want to achieve more. And I think that's like a blessing and a curse that, sometimes I look at these people and I think, well, you know, maybe their life is great because they don't see the world for what it is and they're kind of numb to it. But then I also think, well, we're just trying to unlock the best versions of ourselves on this planet. And I think we're pretty special to be chosen for that and to be able to, as I said, like being working with clients or just friendships, relationships, just wanting to get the best out of people. I think that's a pretty incredible superpower, to be honest with you. But yeah, it's just like that, unfortunately. And I've gotten to the stage where, yeah, like your vitamin D connection you made, like there's no point even really asking them because they're never gonna fucking open their mind around it. So what's important is you funnel that energy into something that is going to be of benefit, or you talk to someone that is going to have like a stimulating conversation with you because you just don't want to resonate to their level. And again, I suppose it's like always have an open mind. Maybe do ask the question and see what they have to say. But as soon as they give you a shitty response, it's like, well, yeah, I see how it is.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it does make sense because, say, like if I were a medicine student, for example, the last thing I'd want to do in my free time is just learn like study medicine, and especially if it like contradicts what I need to learn to pass my degree. Like you're not gonna feel very good about yourself if you're self-studying all these concepts that would get you a bad grade if you actually talked about them in your exam. So yeah, like it does make sense. Everyone's stuck in this centralized system. But on the topic of like holistic health, because I feel like that's such a huge realm on social media, especially. We've got like carnivore, animal based, like the raw primal people, Ray Pete, Jack Cruz. Like you've got all of these like communities online, and it's very interesting how like they all are like decentralized sort of, but there's a lot of infighting between them, and there's just a lot of disagreements between them, and there's also a lot of dogma, like a lot of dogmatic thinking, a lot of blanket statements without any nuance. So, yeah, what are your thoughts on all of these? Like, should we be following all of these social media? Like, are they a net positive because they're decentralized, or are they a net negative because of how dogmatic they can be sometimes?
Yeah, I would say generalizing here, I think there's obviously good accounts that post some good things. And as we said before the recording as well, like it's just like picking and choosing what's going to be applicable to you. But unfortunately, like most people who are trying to heal are pretty easily influenced by someone who's a great writer. Like, Veronica's probably a prime example here, who just posts something all glossy around, fucking methylene blue or B1 or something like that, or like eating sugar, right? And people just latch onto that idea. As I said before, with what was going on with me, I was latching onto a diet because I thought that was the answer. I didn't want to take responsibility for anything deeper. And some people just like that. They want to blame, for example, with carnivore diet, they want to blame vegetables as the boogeyman or fucking mold or whatever it is. But essentially, health optimization and like healing, it comes from looking at it from every single angle. So, and the other argument is, right, especially around the gut, that if you're looking into like Ray Peat's diet and you've got yeast issues or bacterial issues, they're going to feed on sugars. They're going to feed on the FODMAPs that are found predominantly in those in those diets. Whereas like something like carnivore, what if you've got a stomach acid issue? Like I just did a post in a webinar today on stomach acid, and it's literally like the domino effect where stomach acid influences what's going on in the duodenum and the rest of the small intestines, which is going to have a knock-on effect in the colon around like absorption, digestion, what kind of microbiome composition you have. And you got to think with that, right? Like if there's stomach acid issues at play and someone's just shoving down like kilograms of fucking steak, it just it's not fixing anything. If anything, it's making matters worse. And I think the other argument around carnivore is that you're restricting fiber where that fiber is obviously feeding into microbes. So if you've got gut dysbiosis, you're removing their main fuel source. So of course it may relieve symptoms, but it's not addressing the root cause. And I just think a lot of people, even like who was it? Ken Berry or something like that. Like some carnivore guy was saying that like constipation's good. And like every 4 to 5 days, if you take a dump, that's absolutely fine, which is complete bullshit because realistically, like you've just blocked one of your main detoxification pathways and your motility is slow. And what happens when motility is slow? That bacteria can migrate up into the small intestine, ferment on more food, and essentially thrive. So I just think there's so much nuance with all of these diets that are out there. And it's not just limited to diets, but I think like the whole Jack Cruz community, which, I have learnt a lot from that space. But there's still people in that space that just think light is the only fucking thing you have to worry about, where it's not. Like you look, it moves the needle. There's no doubt about it. But then to absolutely disregard everything, like, and I'm sure we'll unpack absolutely what that everything encompasses throughout this podcast. But yeah, to me, I just think you have to really be careful who packs your parachute, especially people who write nice on X and make a really aesthetically looking post. Maybe it's a new fucking supplement, whatever it is. It's just like you have to be really mindful that it's not applicable to you because they don't know anything about your context. As we said before, they don't know anything about your symptoms. They didn't do a deep symptom assessment. They haven't checked your lab work, which again, just like they work together synergistically. Your health history, what's the environment like? And when I say environment, it's not just like an external environment in terms of like light, stability, EMFs, whatever it is, latitude, altitude. It's also like internal environment. So like, what's this person's thoughts processes are like behaviors, trauma, nervous system dysregulation. So it's just when you have all of that, like it, to be honest with you, it becomes really difficult nowadays because there's so much health information out there that most people are fucking bamboozling themselves by just reading so much information. And honestly, that's majority of what my clients are now. They've been like, oh, I tried this, I did that. I tried this supplement because someone said this is good. I did this course, whatever. But it's just like a lot of people, you have to remember, like people online are also trying to sell you something. And the more niche you are, the more people gravitate towards it, right? If you're an all-rounder, there's less of a pull because there's less, I suppose, people love to, as I said, people just love to latch onto something basically. And that's what you see with these communities. And that's why I think you just really have to be mindful and just, do your own research around it, figure out what actually makes sense to you and your biology. That's all I literally try and tell people to do online. And as I said, like before the recording as well, I suppose I'm like referred to as like a circadian based person, but I don't even like that anymore. I want to just be known as like an all-rounder where I have absolutely no dogma whatsoever around certain things, except for obviously like the centralized system, which, throughout this call, you're going to understand why. And you probably already understand why if you've come this far anyway.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think a red flag when you look at these social media cults is if they're making a blanket statement without any nuance. So like with carnivores, all vegetables are bad, all fruits are bad, all sugar's bad. With Ray-P, it's all sugar's good, all omega-3s are bad, all like serotonin, nitric oxide, they're all bad for you. With the Jack Crew stuff, it's like all supplements are bad. And going back to the Ray-P, it's like, well, they say all supplements are good. So it's like these dogmatic blanket statements, they lack nuance and they just don't take into account your individual context. So I think that's a huge red flag. But because I've always thought of it like all of these cults, they are ultimately like decentralized. So I do think it's a net positive for people to sort of use it as a gateway to get into like where I am. I'd say like if you take the whole population, let's say 10% of people find out about like seed oils, which I wish it were 10%, but it's probably like 1%. But like say it were 10% of people who discovered that seed oils were bad and discovered Paul Saladino. And then within that 10%, you might get like 10% of those people discovering the repeat community, and then 10% of the repeat people moving on to, say, the Jack Cruz stuff, and then like 10% of those people moving on to stress and trauma. It's sort of like a funneling system where, like, ultimately everyone is like decentralized at the end of the day. So it's like, when you compare it to like the general population, who they're pretty much just like NPCs, brainwashed, like it does sort of make sense. And I'll like on social media, if I see a post or a tweet from like some generic carnivore account, I'll like talking about how seed oils are bad. Like I'll be like, oh, I've seen this a million times. Like you're not actually telling me anything new. But then when I talk to someone in real life, it's like they've got no idea. So like you've just got to start at that basic level for them.
think that's a great point, to be honest with you. I think there's all these stepping stones. If someone come into what like I speak about, they're probably just going to be shell shocked and think this is fucking crazy. Like, what's this guy on about? So I think you're absolutely right in that regard. But I will say like people who are already exploring everything, I think that's where you have to be careful, like in terms of monitoring what is applicable to you. But yeah, I think that's a good point. Absolutely.
Yeah, because I think if I discovered you like when I was still learning about why seed oils were bad or why eggs like cholesterol is good, like I probably would have become pretty overwhelmed. So I think it's good to have like that carnivore, rapey, Jack Cruise like pipeline.
The funnel. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
But yeah, let's sort of get into some of the more esoteric topics. Let's talk about the sun. Let's talk about like the link between sunlight, melanin, dopamine, even POMC. Because what I've heard Dr. Alexis Cowan say is that like the reason that everyone's addicted to junk food and blue light and drinking and stuff is because they're not getting that dopamine that you're meant to get from the sun. So what's the connection there?
Wait, what was that last bit?
Dr. Alexis said that the reason that people are addicted to processed foods and blue light and alcohol is that they're not getting that dopamine that you're meant to be getting from the sun. So what's the link between the sun, dopamine, melanin, POMC?
Yeah. So I would say like out of all the neurotransmitters, dopamine's the one that seems to be attacked the most. And then of course, like downstream of that, you've got other neurotransmitters that are playing a big role, like endorphins, cannabinoids, GABA, glutamate balance, acetylcholine, serotonin, noradrenaline. So all of these are like, and then on top of that, you've got neurohormones that are like derived from DHT, DHEA, progesterone, etc. So the thing with dopamine is it seems like that's the main one that's under attack, right? And I think when you trace it back to what's going on with tyrosine, like tyrosine is what forms L-DOPA, L-DOPA is what forms melanin, it's what forms dopamine, noradrenaline, adrenaline, and coenzyme Q10 is formed from tyrosine as well. And then on top of that, tyrosine also forms thyroid hormone. So I think there's a bit of a connection with all of these that when one system's impacted, the other also falls. And you see that with like Parkinson's having hypothyroidism or melanoma. Um, and the thing with tyrosine, same with like tryptophan, same with phenylalanine, same with histidine, is that they absorb a decent amount of UV light, UVA, UVB, UVC. And I would say that like the sunlight is one of the main drivers there. And everything that's somewhat artificial, like artificial blue light, exposure to your phone, and like doom scrolling, processed foods, anything that gives you that cheap high, drugs, alcohol, that's going to degrade dopamine. And by design, that's going to also degrade melanin through many mechanisms. So, and you got to think like melanin is somewhat like this huge sheet that is found throughout many areas. Like we've internalized it. So we've used it for many things, like for its semiconductor properties, for controlling like light signals and magnetic signals from like free radicals. On top of that, like chelating heavy metals. So it's a very important molecule to have. And I think like that whole pathway gets pretty cooked when we're not exposing ourselves to natural cycles. And that's sunlight connection to POMC is a big one as well. But I would say it's not just like sunlight, it's also like the biophotons as well. So I will say like sunlight, grounding, like doing all the things that reflect nature is going to feed into your mitochondria. And then your mitochondria are going to spit out like biophotons that are going to essentially interact with these aromatic amino acids and other things as well. So like even things such as like microtubules, which we see could be reflective of what's going on with consciousness. And that's where tyrosine and tryptophan residues are actually found as well. Water, collagen, etc. So there's many semiconductors going on. And I think like the whole thing with sunlight is that mechanistically it enhances our effects of running our mitochondria properly. So then oxygen gets reduced essentially. And when that happens, the ability to tunnel electrons and recycle protons is upregulated and it's like a smooth sailing system. With dopamine, in this case, the main thing I would say is just because of its link to melanin, when we see like a lack of sunlight, it's going to degrade the system to a degree that we have to seek external sources, which is exactly what Dr. Alexis said. And I suppose the issue with that is that like we're essentially got a sponge and like imagine that's filled with like tyrosine or dopamine or melanin, and we're squeezing it until there's no water droplets left. And I think most people who are constantly exposing themselves to artificial dopamine are constantly draining that sponge and trying to squeeze out as much as they can. And what fundamentally happens is when you have low dopamine by design, you're not rebuilding it from sunlight and darkness, and the abstaining of uh, uh, using artificial dopamine. I mean, I just look at it as an example. Like I've got a pet bearded dragon and a pet puppy now, and they don't check their fucking phones. They just sit with their thoughts. They're not getting stimulated all the time. And I think the more that you get stimulated, that dopamine drops. And what's the link with dopamine? I mean, like there's many things like it influences what's going on with sex hormones in the pituitary gland. But on top of that, it's fundamental to what's going on in your prefrontal cortex. And that ties in with judgment, like judgment, decision making, executive function, working memory, uh, attention and focus, even like I would say the level of like awareness as well. So obviously, like when I explain that, it makes complete sense to lower dopamine as much as you can, because what that essentially does, it makes you the perfect modern human where you don't question anything. Again, we're tying it back with your chemistry teacher, as in this case. I don't know him obviously, but I'm just making assumptions here. Doesn't question anything, just goes with the fucking flow, living that 9 to 5. Not thinking for himself, right? Like all of these things is essentially what encompasses what low dopamine is. And I think the other effect as well is that if you're not getting proper sunlight exposure on top of everything else, like that's detrimental to your health. By design, you have shitty redox for a number of reasons because of what's going on with mitochondria, melanin, melatonin. And what fundamentally happens there is that when you do get that squeeze of that dopamine from that dopamine gets metabolized into more neurotoxic products that don't get cleared properly. And that's another huge consideration as well. And we see that, I think, in many conditions like schizophrenia, and anything that's sort of neuropsychiatric, that's going to have that sort of pathway involved. So that was a bit of a tangent in terms of dopamine. But yeah, the ultimate take home from that is that low dopamine is essentially like a low dopamine state is what shapes a modern human to not question anything, not think for themselves, not take matters into their own hands, and essentially just become controllable, sick, and weak.
No, 100%. I mean, I forgot who I forgot who posted this, but there was a study on how like neuroplasticity, like the lack of neuroplasticity and the inability for people to change their minds when they're exposed to new information, that's tied to a lack of dopamine. I think it was a lack of dopamine, but it would make sense if it were because they're just not being challenged. They're not thinking for themselves. So yeah, like you would say that comes down to a disrupted like sun light environment, circadian rhythm, lack of sunlight.
Yeah, well, sunlight provides the instruction manual, right, to build up all these semiconductors, neurotransmitters, and hormones um, at the right times, to signal at the right times to essentially control you to make you as optimal as possible, right? Especially when we are exposed to everything that nature encompasses. And I'm just trying to think, I did like probably a year ago, I did a massive dive into dopamine. And I would say that like dopamine beyond what you mentioned as well, like it's also linked to circadian entrainment. So it plays a big role there. I mentioned it's like regulation of like sex hormones as well through controlling prolactin. And then within that, like it's also a pretty important hormone in the peripheral body that controls immune system, like immune function, controls gut motility as well in synergism with serotonin and a few other neurotransmitters. So I suppose like maybe this brain stuff as well, like the nervous system stuff around dopamine is just the tip of the iceberg. I think there's even links I remember seeing around like insulin signaling as well. So I think the dopamine story is a good one. It's a big one that really connects a lot of dots. And I suppose like the main take home from it is that everything in the modern world is out to get your dopamine basically at every single corner. Like even me being in Philippines on an island, like you can still get caught up in doom scrolling or maybe just watching a Netflix show and you can still get sucked in. It's everywhere. I suppose, of course, like in cities, it's obviously easier, and then you're not getting that light exposure on top, and the strong UV. So yeah, and if it's not strong UV, it's cold exposure that also increases dopamine by like 200% and noradrenaline. So yeah, I think it's an interesting one, isn't it, with dopamine? And I think it, as I said, it ties in with tyrosine, it ties in what's going on with POMC, and POMC responds to light around melanin, but then also beta endorphins. So and also cortisol, well, ACTH, which down the line forms cortisol. And I think like the light that we put ourselves under is probably one of the biggest factors here because of how constant it is in the modern world. If it wasn't much of a thing prior to artificial light, because we had campfires, but that was about it. Then it was just darkness, maybe some star and moonlight. But then we were constantly getting sun exposure throughout the day, or just at least being in the shade where you still get like scattering of UV and a ton of infrared. So yeah, I think it's pretty wild when you think about it, like how disconnected we are from all of that. And it's not just the dopamine, it's also just everything that sunlight builds, which I could talk for hours in terms of what that encompasses. But at the end of the day, it still just comes back down to how well our mitochondria are running and how well oxygen's reduced at cytochrome C oxidase. That's like the main component that essentially dictates everything else in our biology.
Yeah, I mean, if you're wearing sunglasses, you're not going to be converting that tyrosine into L-dopa, into melanin, and into dopamine. Um, so let's talk about POMC and let's sort of get like a bit nerdy for people. Like, what's POMC? What are the breakdown products that it cleaves into, and how do we optimize our POMC pathway?
Yeah, so what's important to note here as well is like POMC expression's found like in many cell types, like throughout the whole nervous system, throughout like regions of like, well, the nervous system, in the heart, in the testes, like in the liver, like in the bone marrow, and melanin's linked to that as well. But what POMC essentially is it's a light-based peptide, polypeptide that essentially responds to light, and that light isn't just from like external light sources like sunlight and blue light, but also from internal light sources. And depending, you can sort of think of it like a barcode that kind of gets sliced and diced, and it will form different products, as you mentioned before. And the main ones are like MSH. So you got alpha, gamma, and beta MSH. And I think what's important to note about alpha MSH is that it forms melanin production. Oh, it's required for melanin production, but it's also tied to appetite suppression as well. So the more sunlight you get, the more you stimulate this pathway where you don't feel like eating as much because you're harvesting energy from the sun and putting your feet on the earth. And the other thing around MSH as well is that all these peptides like KPV, I believe maybe lorazepam as well, melanotan too, like these are all like really potent anti-inflammatory peptides that are great for the gut and just for the whole body. But little do people know that like it's literally alpha MSH or a fragment of it that acts on melanocortin receptors. So that's one of them. And I mentioned melanin before, so that's one of the downstream effects is melanogenesis, which is obviously pretty big in terms of not just melanizing ourselves externally, but also internally wherever POMC is found. So this is where that biophoton story kicks in with what's going on with the mitochondria, what kind of light are they spitting out, and then ACTH, so that's another cleavage product, and that predominantly gets stimulated by blue light. So we got to think that we still get blue light coupled with UV during the day, and then in the mornings when there's no UV, you get that blue light. So you're getting this nice quantized pulse of ACTH, which down the line forms cortisol, and cortisol is like one of our main stress hormones that keeps us alert. And there's no harm in cortisol at those levels. However, we got to think what else is blue light found in? It's found in tech devices and LED lights after sunset or just during the day, and we're lacking that UV and infrared light, which is absolutely crucial for our biology. So we're just getting this huge peak of blue light, which in itself does other effects in terms of like liberating vitamin A and destroying heme proteins and destroying cell membranes and inducing mitochondrial dysfunction and fucking up what's going on with vitamin D. But yeah, this whole cortisol story is interesting as well. So when it's in balance, it's excellent. It's an anti-inflammatory as well. So it is great in terms of lowering lymphocytes and immune cells in the right amounts. So we actually need it. And I think like the major problem with blue light is not a cortisol release. It's like adrenal hyposufficiency where we cannot make these hormones anymore. It's not about like pregnenolone steal syndrome. It's literally about like our mitochondria are so dysfunctional, we can't make steroid hormones no longer. Then we got beta endorphins. So again, like would tie in with the dopamine story as well, that like POMC, when it's exposed predominantly to UVB light and also some cold exposure can raise beta endorphins. And what do beta endorphins do? They act as an inhibitory neuropeptide in the brain to essentially disinhibit dopamine circuits in your nucleus accumbens, which is tied to reward and pleasure. So essentially, like, and I'm sure as we have a deeper conversation around sunlight, like we're just going to unravel everything that it does. But that within itself, like POMC to provide all those products in a quantized fashion. But tying in with the dopamine story with beta endorphin and how that can increase dopamine as well. It's like, well, what else increases dopamine really? That's from a natural stimuli. It's sex. It's like hunting and like eating good food, finding water and like drinking it when you're like really thirsty. So, and then sunlight. So you got to think, well, it's obviously like dopamine, and I didn't mention this before, but dopamine's a reinforcing mechanism, right? So we get a release when we're doing something good. And obviously that system's been hijacked. So that's why we're stuck in feedback loops of doom scrolling, drugs, alcohol, etc. So yeah, it's just that sunlight story again, like beyond just like the UV interacting with tyrosine or phenylalanine to form L-DOPA and dopamine, it's also a story of POMC and what cleavage products get liberated. And we got to think that like a modern world, being in an environment where we can't utilize oxygen properly, we're going to downgrade the system basically. So we don't want to even make melanin in this case because it's a powerful semiconductor and we have no hydration at cytochrome C oxidase. So our body chooses to release ACTH and cortisol because of the cleavage of blue light in isolation.
No, that's great. I mean, yeah, POMC's got so many cleavage products. So is it just a matter of optimizing your circadian rhythm, getting the right wavelengths at the right time so that you're able to cleave POMC into those products?
Yeah, well, I would say like it's obviously going to play a big role, but then this is the argument where like sometimes sunlight isn't just enough for certain people, and this is where like things other deeper interventions may be needed. Like if someone has gut dysbiosis, like sunlight may flare them up, right? And then when that happens, you got to think that like if inflammation rises, then mitochondria spit out different light frequencies, different biophotons that interact with POMC in different ways. And we actually do see that, like with, for example, like you would probably know this because you're doing chemistry, but
Mhm.
carbonyl radicals, which are actually found in PUFAs and other peroxides, where that actually emits blue light. So it emits 400 to 550 nanometer blue light. So if there's inflammation from lipopolysaccharides, acetaldehyde, or something like that, it has the potential to damage cell membranes and to liberate this light. And then on top of that, it's going to alter what's going with oxygen. And then what happens with oxygen is we get different pulses of hydrogen peroxide, superoxide, hydroxyl radicals, nitrogen oxide, and that will give you a different signature of what those biophotons are going to be, but also within themselves, they're going to also control signaling and timing. And where was I going with that? So like with sunlight, like yes, it's obviously great, but then I think there's just like other things where, you know, and this is what ties in with like stress, trauma, emotional dysregulation on top, where like sometimes like sunlight is obviously great. You'd rather have it than not, but some people need deeper interventions in order to regulate the system. And one of those ways to regulate the system is what's going on with POMC, right? Because if we are not using oxygen properly and we can't make metabolic water and we can't hydrate our melanin sheets, then there's no point in making melanin because we can't do it. And stress, emotional dysregulation will, by design, like any sort of fear, induces hypoxia and the cell danger response. And when we do that, we're literally downgrading the system because we're trying to accompany for the ability of not being able to use oxygen. And as I said, like the oxygen ties in with light emissions and things of that nature. And that's what we see with POMC being dysregulated. And that's just one example. Like there's so many more, but obviously just tying in with what you said, I think like the whole POMC story, there's just like there's the light that we see out right now, like, and you can see out your window, but then there's the light internally that is also having such a significant impact. And so many things can influence what's going on with that.
Well, let's talk specifically about the link between light and metabolism slash weight loss. And in the context of like mitochondria, let's talk about like glycolysis, the TCA cycle, the electron transport chain, concepts like quantum tunneling, UV biophotons, because I mean, I've heard say what you want about Paul Saladino, but I've he's got a really good podcast about like he just breaks down the mitochondria and all of the complexes, and he gets really esoteric, talking about how all the different complexes run and what signals they produce. But he didn't really bring up like quantum tunneling or deuterium. So like let's because that was like 5 years ago. But let's like sort of talk about how light impacts our mitochondria and how mitochondria can actually make light itself.
Yeah. So if we start with like the metabolic pathways, I think with glycolysis, right, it's especially if it's done anaerobically, I think there's many things going on. And if you trace the steps of what's going on with any of these metabolic pathways, you can see what's going on with oxygen, with cofactors involved, with water, and end products basically. And I think like a prime example is what's going on with anaerobic glycolysis is that it's an inability to use oxygen, which can be stemmed from any sort of stress. And what's interesting is that lactate within itself is formed at the end of that. And that, because goes through glycolysis, it could be deuterium depleted. So it could be essentially acting as a protective mechanism to try and remove use a fuel source that's low in deuterium that because we can't use oxygen. So it's like a sparing mechanism in terms of that. So you got the glycolysis pathway, you got the pentose phosphate pathway, which somewhat ties in with it as well. And then you've got beta oxidation, which is from fatty acids, which can occur not just in the mitochondria, but then also in peroxisomes as well. And Stephanie Senefer actually made some interesting connections with that like peroxisomes are a source of deuterium depleted water because the long chain fatty acids that go through there make hydrogen peroxide, which can down the line make low deuterium water. So there's other things going on. And even with myelin as well is an interesting one that it buffers protons. So like, and then has electron transport chain components, which is pretty fucking cool within itself to think that like, I think there's just so much we don't know. But to tie in with what you said with metabolic pathways and stuff, I think like the most important thing to dissect is that how much mitochondria is found in that cell and what kind of metabolism are they using. And I think that is going to give you clues in terms of what that cell is required to do, what kind of free radicals it will spit out and by photons, and even like shifts in the metabolism as well. So for example, with like neutrophils or macrophages, lymphocytes, like immune cells, they all have certain shifts where they may use like glycolysis under certain states when they're activated, but then under states of resting, they'll use oxidative phosphorylation. They also use like glutamine, and that it also ties in with like other things like the heart, like the cardiomyocytes predominantly use beta oxidation. The gut lining uses butyrate. Or the colonocytes, that is. Then, like the enterocytes use glutamine. So there's all these different fuel sources that are used. And I suppose we don't really know why that is. Like, why would one organ use something different than the other? Why is it using different metabolic pathways? Why is there less mitochondria? I mean, like the mitochondria thing makes a bit more sense, but I suspect that it's tied to oxygen tensions, and those oxygen tensions, which is obviously reflective of blood flow, how much oxygen directly gets to that tissue. And again, this is probably why there's shifts in white blood cells, where if they go to a place where there's low oxygen tensions, they have to shift their metabolic state, right? So what I think is going on around that is that these oxygen tensions send out, again, I know that I sound like a broken record, but they're sending out like biophoton emissions that are controlling the timing and signaling of these cells. And with the quantum tunneling side of things, I believe that like so with electrons, with protons, even deuterons, so deuterium, they all have the ability to tunnel. And obviously, the smaller something is, the easier it is to tunnel. So that's hence the issue with deuterium. And then also within that is that the kinetic isotope effect of deuterium slows down enzymatic rates by like fivefold, tenfold, 20-fold, even up to like 100-fold, depending on what is incorporated inside that enzyme. And with with the tunneling, that whole what Paul Saladino was talking about was the electron transport chain where electrons get passed through. And again, it depends on what oxygen is found there, and how much of it is it has the ability to be used. And of course, that's going to be stimulated by infrared light predominantly and low stress levels. The electrons follow through that chain and they pump out protons into intermembrane space to create the gradient. And there's also proton tunneling occurring there. And that's the most beautiful thing in biology, because that's essentially what drives life. And there is tunneling involved, and on the electron level and the proton level there, and also in various enzymes as well. So like things such as like NADPH will be using it for the pentose phosphate pathway, or steroidogenesis or detoxification. And the beauty of tunneling is that you don't use any energy. It's essentially like the idea behind tunneling on that quantum level is like you think of like a hill, right? It takes a lot of energy to go up and down the hill, but with tunneling, it goes straight through instantaneously, like a lot faster, and no energy has been used, which is the paradox of why it makes it quantum, because it just doesn't make any sense from a biochemical standpoint. And I would say that the more you become quantum coherent, the more you get connected to nature, the more you have those abilities to essentially do those mechanisms, those quantum mechanisms within you, to make yourself more efficient, basically. And we reflect back to what Paul Saladino said about the electron transport chain, which I actually don't know what you're referring to there, but I'm surprised he was actually speaking about that 5 years ago. But the dance between the electrons going through and the protons getting pumped out is fundamental to life. And the more efficient you can do that, the more you can make metabolic water, the more the signals of the biphotons and the free radicals are quantized to your environment to essentially make you thrive. So that's the idea behind the whole tunneling thing. And if you wanted me to like elaborate on like the metabolic pathways, I'm happy to. But I think there's just so much nuance from like each cell, each tissue, the mitochondrial density. Like it's all very different in terms of what fundamentally goes on there.
Yeah, it's such a complex system. I mean, if my knowledge is correct, so you've got glycolysis, which is the breakdown of glucose, and that happens inside the cell but outside the mitochondria. And then that gets converted into pyruvate, which enters the mitochondria to make acetyl-CoA, which, and then acetyl-CoA combines with oxaloacetate to go through the TCA cycle. And that happens in the matrix. If you imagine like the mitochondria, it's like two membranes, and inside the inner membrane, you've got the matrix. And then the TCA cycle will pump out like NADPH, FADH2, and that will get sent, or that will drop off electrons in the intermembrane, in the inner membrane, which goes through the complexes and pumps protons to the inner membrane space. So that's between the two membranes. And then ultimately it's about making that water at complex 4, isn't it? Like making sure you've got enough oxygen to convert into water at complex 4. Is that accurate, would you say?
Yeah, and I think like the whole idea about around the oxygen story is that because that's one of the most electronegative atoms uh, in existence in the universe, that like we have shifted to an environment that had high oxygen tensions and levels, that we had to learn to adapt to it, and that's where we draw electrons to that, which essentially creates that metabolic water that we spoke of, but then at the same time generating that proton gradient that allows for ATP to be made, which unfolds proteins to essentially allow water to bind to it for its quantum properties. And on top of that, I suppose there's the whole phosphorylation thing on the biochemical level. I'm not ruling that out, but I think there's obviously more to the story, like when we look into the biophysics of it. And yeah, the other thing that I forgot to mention there is that like that proton gradient, there's the ATPase at complex 5, and that's what spins. And infrared light actually supercharges that. And when it spins, it increases like its magnetic field locally within that mitochondria. But then, of course, like when you think about it, there's many mitochondria within the cell. And then within those cells, like within like the cells, there's like a tissue, like for example, the brain, which is very mitochondrial dense, and same with the heart. And that's why we have this like magnetic field that comes from them, because of the mitochondria and the metabolism of oxygen there, and the infrared light that influences that. But I will say that like if there is high deuterium in that region, so again, like Laszlo Boros, Gabor something, I forgot his name, and then also Stephanie Seneff, they've actually spoken about this in great detail, that like you can think of it like a basketball ring, right? Where you throw one basketball in, that's like equivalent to a proton, and if it swishes in perfectly, then ATP gets made, and that doesn't get clogged up. And oxygen, again, because it's going to yoke to oxygen, because the magnetic effect of oxygen is paramagnetic, so it gets drawn to these magnetic fields. Um, But if it's deuterium, then it's got a proton and a neutron. So it's double the atomic mass. And it's like fitting two basketballs. I'm sure you've seen that before, where two basketballs fit through a ring, it gets stuck. And that's essentially what happens. And then you have this backlog effect of oxygen and protons and electrons that essentially oxygen doesn't get reduced properly. And this is where we see these excessive releases of these free radicals and even light emissions as well. So when I mention biophotons, I'm not just talking about like, we just need like as much light as we can. No, it's like it's all about like being controlled, and like the fidelity of that signal is fundamental. And this is where um, the light that gets emitted from the mitochondria or any other resource, like it needs to be controlled. And this is why we have like melanin, microtubules, water, and all of these semiconductors that essentially quench that light and turn it into different forms of energy, like through energy transduction, because that's what semiconductors basically do. And this is what we see with diseases where all diseases that I've researched and seen research on, and there's not that much research, but there's probably a good 50 diseases that they've done research on. A lot of them are spitting out excessive biophotons from the cells or from their bodies. And what that fundamentally tells you is that there is issues with oxygen utilization and issues with energy and entropy. So entropy is obviously tied to organization within the cell. We want to be at like that near zero entropy state. And we need a lot of energy funneled into the system to be utilized properly to essentially stay at that state. When we're not at that state, then energy is lost, entropy rises. And this is exactly what we see with diseases, where organization at that atomic level of cells and extracellular like matrix, etc. It's all what was I going to say around that? The light signal and the energy and information is getting lost like out of the system. And that's essentially what's going on with the universe, like over these last 4 billion years or whatever it's been, that we are slowly becoming disorganized. And that's why the universe is essentially going to end at some stage, because of what is going on. But we can obviously talk about that around our human body as well. And that's essentially what aging basically is this loss of entropy over time. And we can't use energy and information like we could when we were a child. And that obviously links back to like how much water we have. For example, you're probably, you're about 20, 21, 22?
21. I'm 21.
Yeah, and I'm 30. So you probably have slightly more water than I have. And then Julian, when he was 5 years old, had a lot more water than what Julian
Yeah.
has now. And that's obviously going to reflect what's going on energetically, because of how water hydrates proteins, lipids, and semiconductors in general to essentially make us coherent.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. On the top, you brought up how oxygen's electronegative, and that's how it attracts electrons to make water at complex 4. And this goes back to like what we spoke about earlier about the centralized education system, is that in chemistry we learn that fluorine's the most electronegative atom, and fluoride, the ion, it's like it's an electron withdrawing group. And then in biology we learn about the electron transport chain, and how, like you said, complex 4 takes up oxygen at complex 4 takes up electrons to make water. But then if I told either of those lecturers that, like, okay, well then logically this means fluoride's bad for us, right? Because it steals electrons from oxygen, and they'd be like, they'd look at me like I was crazy because it doesn't fit their narrative. But going back to what you said about oxygen tensions and stuff. So you've talked about how cholesterol is actually made from oxygen, isn't it? It's like 11 molecules of oxygen and a few molecules of NADPH. So what would cause, so I'm guessing that's excess oxygen. So what would cause that oxygen to make cholesterol instead of making water? Is that just like a lack of electrons, lack of protons that's forcing the oxygen to go down a different pathway? Like what could that be caused by?
So it's protective. Like, and when you see on a blood test like elevated LDL or total cholesterol, I'm keeping that at the back of my head, because you got to think like, if we're using 11 molecules of oxygen to make cholesterol, therefore like cholesterol is an oxygen sink. So it's kind of going there to be wasted when we're hypoxic for any sort of stressful scenario. And when I say stress, I'm not talking about just mental stress, but metabolic stress, light stress, environmental stress. Anything associated to that is going to activate the same pathways basically, and that's going to be tied to like hypoxia, HIF1 alpha. is going to essentially drive that. And it's not just cholesterol as well. Like we got to think that you mentioned that, like, is it electrons, is it protons, is it oxygen? It's a combination of everything because the oxygen can't be used. So therefore the protons and electrons aren't usable in the mitochondria. And what fundamentally happens is that, like, if we have all this fuel, it's like thinking of a car that runs 3 miles per gallon, and we keep filling fuel into it. That what are we going to do with that fuel? We're going to save it for later, and that's essentially what fat accumulation is, right? And unfortunately, like, it's not just like subcutaneous fat that accumulates, but it's also visceral fat found near our organs as well. And maybe, like, I would say that that's probably a fair reason why visceral fat starts to accumulate is because mitochondrial rich tissues can't use oxygen anymore. And this is essentially why we see this accumulation. And of course, it's obviously going to be mostly in the liver because that's where lipogenesis essentially is mostly done. So yeah, I think the whole the whole basis of, like, not being able to use oxygen is how the system downgrades and protects itself. And I like to use the analogy of, like, my when I used to work in, like, the power line industry, that, like, we would upgrade the system with wires because there'd be more houses. Yeah, we'd have bigger conductors, maybe bigger transformers. And what that essentially means is, like, there's more power, there's more energy that can be used. Yeah. The difference between power lines and our biology is that our biology is a lot more advanced in terms of regulating energy input and output. And that's why oxygen tensions act as a controlling arm of what's going on in the mitochondria, what's going with proton and electron usage. And what happens, as I said before, like, these semiconductors are yoked to water and how that water is made in the mitochondria, and also to a degree, like what's going on in the large bowel with water absorption there. But I think the body is only trying to protect itself and accommodate. So that's what I see, like how glycolysis is, where glucose gets shunted through. We can't use any other metabolic pathways because it's too dangerous to. Like, driving a car that's 3 miles per gallon and then loading up a bunch of fuel and then hoping to drive 100 kilometers an hour, or miles an hour, should I say. It's just, it's, it's impossible. And our biology is literally just trying to do it the best it can. And unfortunately, the environment that we put ourselves in has compromised that. And that's exactly why we're seeing all of these diseases, because it's literally like a bioelectrical disease where we're downgrading the whole system. And reflecting back to, like, working on power lines and how we would have power outages and things of that nature, and we go and repair it, our body's basically doing the same thing. It's like, okay, where's the outage going to be? Is it going to be in your thyroid gland? Is it going to be in your adrenals? Is it going to be in your pancreas? And when there's a defect there, that's where we start seeing these issues. And I suppose at its root, like, all of these diseases are just like a bioenergetic issue, which I think ties in with, like, what the rape peak community and a lot of communities actually say. But we're kind of taking it a step further and looking at it more closely in terms of, like, what is bioenergetics. And what it basically is, as I said before, it's like how well we can use the second most electronegative atom in the universe that is abundant in our atmosphere. And that obviously relates, as I said before, to how electrons and protons essentially flow.
Yeah, so what would actually cause complex like our mitochondria to not be able to use oxygen? Is that just say like complex four breaking down, causing oxygen like it can't make water? And then what happens to the protons and electrons that can't make water? Do they just like make more ATP instead at complex five?
So stress, as I said before, it's any kind of stress on the system. So that can look like a lack of sunlight exposure, a lack of infrared light. It can look like gut dysbiosis, where, as I said, with the lipopolysaccharides or any sort of endotoxin could be exacerbating issues on a mitochondrial level. Issues with blood flow. So again, like, sitting down and being sedentary is going to compromise how oxygen gets to your tissues. Anything like that. And it's honestly, it's everything. Like, it's everything that encompasses stress will cause that. And what happens is, I think I mentioned earlier, it's not that we just make ATP. It's the whole flow from complex one to complex four is busted. So the what happens is it gets backfed, and this is essentially where we see backlogs and oxygen reacting prematurely to essentially form superoxide at complex 1, hydrogen peroxide at complex 3. And as I said before, they obviously have effects within themselves, but then when they get reduced, eventually they will emit biophotons. And depending on the concentrations, the amounts, the ratios between all of these, that's going to determine what the cell's biology is fundamentally going to do from like a timing, signaling, and energetic perspective, really. And not only that, but then the TCA cycle is also going to be clogged up as well. And I didn't mention this earlier, but the TCA cycle directly ties in with the urea cycle. And fumarate is essentially what shifts deuterium into the urea cycle to get excreted. So there's that as well. And then I think the buildup of citrate, if you think of that within itself, like in the mitochondria, because citrate buildup reflects that mitochondrial dysfunction to a degree. And what citrate fundamentally does is it creates, it forms back, it leaves the mitochondria, forms acetyl CoA, and then it forms melanin CoA, and that leads to lipogenesis. So you've got that going on, right? And you got to think, well, that's an energetic issue within itself. That why citrate not forming isocitrate down the line and everything else, and the TCA cycle was running correctly. And then you got to think, well, if there's an intersection between the urea cycle and TCA cycle with deuterium, oxygen, protons, electrons, and then of course, like you've got like nutrients as well, which are fundamental to drive some of these enzyme reactions, like the B vitamins, magnesium, iron sulfur clusters. So if there's any defects in any of that, that's where you get these bottlenecks of the system, and that essentially will lead to protection as much as we can. And I didn't mention this earlier, but like with oxygen as well, it's not just limited to what's going on in the mitochondria. It's also tied in with like hydroxylase enzymes. So again, that's tying in with like tyrosine and tryptophan hydroxylase, which connects with making those neurotransmitters we mentioned before, serotonin, melatonin, dopamine, noradrenaline. Melanin is also like the production of melanin is also oxygen dependent. Collagen is oxygen dependent. So we got to think, right? Like if we can't use oxygen, we're not going to be able to use those enzymes. And as I said before, we downgrade the system, and it ultimately just depends on where that downgrade is actually happening. And for most people, it's going to be systemic, but they may notice like defects in certain areas. That's why you may get links around like the gut and the thyroid gland, or the nervous system in the gut, or the liver in the gut. Whatever it fundamentally is, it is like at its root, it's that energetic issue. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but hopefully that gave you a bit more than you were expecting.
No, it made sense. I mean, on that Saladino podcast, actually, he brought up reverse electron transport, which happens when there's like too many electrons. So they actually flow backwards from complex 5 back to 1. And he said that when that happens, we get these superoxide pulses, which actually signal satiety, and like they actually make us feel full, which I guess would make sense from a protective point of view. And he says that the issue that with seed oils is that when they enter beta oxidation, because they've already got a double bond, they're not making FADH2, because FADH2 is made when like it converts a saturated fat into a like a double bond. But if it's already got that double bond, that means there's less FADH2 in the mitochondria, and that means there's like less chance for reverse electron transport, which would mean less superoxide signals to make you satiated. Is that sort of what's going on here?
Yeah, I would say like also superoxide can lead to I want to say autophagy as well. So it just depends on the pulse at play. And with uh with PUFAs and any sort of fatty acid, I mean, if it's going through beta oxidation, it's still going to generate FADH2, which is going to feed into complex
Mhm.
2. But it obviously just depends on how long the carbon chain fundamentally is. I actually haven't looked into that, to be honest, in terms of what he said. Feel free to send me that afterwards, actually, because I'll look into it. But um, yeah, like so he was saying that superoxide leads to satiety. Yeah, I suppose like the other thing is that like again, it depends where it's made. Another mechanism is like with citrate buildup, there can also be a buildup of hydrogen peroxide, which then again like lowers GLUT4 transporters on cell membranes to essentially prevent glucose transport in. And we got to think, well, why is that? Because it's protecting you. We don't have enough. We can't combust the fuel because of either again like deuterium buildup. We can't use electrons properly, and oxygen's not getting reduced. at 100% capacity. So we're yoking our whole biology to whatever that level of oxygenation fundamentally is, or utilization of it, should I say. And I can't remember what you asked, but yeah, what did you ask? I can't even remember, but it was something about
Well,
superoxide, was it?
yeah, so I was just saying that on the podcast, Paul said that when you get reverse electron transport, this releases superoxide as a like a satiety signal, which is why if you're generating less FADH2 by eating polyunsaturated fats, you're not going to get that satiety signal, which I found quite interesting. So I guess that would be superoxide acting as like a protective mechanism to like signal to your cells that you've had too much food, you've had enough food, which is why if you get like if you're not having that signal, it could cause people to overeat. So I found that quite interesting.
Yeah, yeah, I think feel free to send me that because I'd be curious because I would have a different opinion on that. Um, because I just think like maybe on that cellular level that could be occurring, but we have to think like if there's neuroinflammation in the hypothalamus, that's going to dysregulate what's going on with POMC neurons and AGRP neurons in terms of controlling satiety signals and hunger and things of that nature. And then I suppose even tying in with that, like what's going on with the gut, what's going on with like hormones like CCK, even like things such as like bile can have and like short chain fatty acids can influence appetite as well. So I think it's just like, yeah, we can look at one mechanism around that and maybe we can come to a hypothesis. But I think it's kind of like it seems to me it's a bit one dimensional in terms of that because we have to be looking at the whole system at play here as well. If we're just looking at one cell doing one thing, then you know, as I said before, like our cells contain different levels of mitochondria, different energy metabolic pathways, different oxygen tensions. So I think that's where we want to be looking at. And then we haven't even spoken about the gut microbiome here as well, which plays a fundamental role in terms of its outputs and what it spits out for us in terms of short chain fatty acids, nutrients, neurotransmitters, etc. So yeah, I think yeah, it's just it's something that it could be a mechanism, but I like to look at the body more like from the standpoint, okay, sure, superoxide may be affecting that. And I actually haven't seen anything around that to tell you the truth. But what is going on that systemic level? Because again, like superoxide can control like it's like a magnetic molecule, which again, this will time with like magnetic fields and even just EMFs in general, like the timing of what goes on. But then, as I said before, it gets reduced into like biophotons, and those biophotons control signaling. So yeah, it just ultimately depends on like the concentrations of that, what else is going on, to essentially govern the body in terms of its functions. And like in this case, we're talking about appetite. But yeah, I think there's just more to the story around it. But I would love for you to send me that because I'll look into it. I'd be curious.
Yeah, it's a great podcast. I mean, I think it was like the end of 2020. Um, so like there wasn't like nobody's really talking about quantum health or whatnot, but it's really interesting. But on the topic of to go back to what you said about cholesterol being used to soak up oxygen. So why would that be beneficial? Like, what happens if, like, is that protecting us from oxygen doing bad things, in the body? Because I've heard Dr. Alexis again. She said that oxygen in the gut actually inhibits the growth of beneficial microbes like bifidobacteria. So is that the reason that cholesterol's stealing oxygen from the gut to is that like a protective mechanism?
So again, it comes back to I think like we're going around a bit of a circle, but like it's about like the mitochondria, like in every single tissue, and how well oxygen can be used. With the gut, like the gut for especially the colon is predominantly anaerobic, so oxygen there is going to become a bit of a problem, and maybe like that's what we actually see with issues in gut dysbiosis, where if we have the inability to use oxygen, we're still breathing it in. No matter how much we try to adapt from like a biomechanical standpoint, breathing through our mouth, chest breathing, all of these things to try and prevent ourselves from breathing in more oxygen and retaining more CO2, there is still probably that leakage that influences what's going on in the gut microbiome. And there is some microbes, like for example, like something like Klebsiella, where it will utilize oxygen. And there's other microbes that are like aerotolerant, where they can sort of be in the middle of both. And I believe that's something like bifidobacterium. So yeah, it's again, there's a lot of don't know, like we don't knows around this. Like there's a lot of unanswered questions because there's not a lot of research around something as niche as this. But it's still just, again, it just comes back to how well those mitochondria are running and how well bioenergetics is running on that level. And again, it still just comes back to how well we copy nature and plug into it, basically. And the more that we're disconnect from it, the more our body's compromised, the more we downgrade our body as a protective mechanism. And sometimes there's just knock-on effects, like, and that's exactly what we see in the gut. Because we've got to remember our gut is like this active tissue as well, where our gut lining got the mucous membrane, we've got the gut associated lymphoid tissues that sits behind it, and they're all going to have like a bit of a feedback loop in terms of what's going on with the microbiome and the actual composition of it. And that gut microbiome is also going to influence what's going on with the gut lining cells and the integrity of it as well. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of unknowns around all of this. I like where your questions are heading, but yeah, I just don't think we know the answers to a lot of this stuff as well. Like, why is cholesterol doing this versus like what's going on in the gut? We really just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it makes sense that the reason a lot of carnivores have gut issues is because I don't know, maybe they're making lots of cholesterol because their stress or whatever is causing their oxygen to be used in the wrong way, and then maybe they're making too much oxygen and that's going to the gut and depleting their good bacteria. Like I think there could be a lot of connections going on here.
You mean making too much oxygen in terms of like not being used?
I suppose, yeah, or like you said, like they're breathing in oxygen and it's not being used, so like it's being used to make cholesterol, but there's only so much cholesterol that you can make, so it might be going to the gut and further depleting their good bacteria. Like I'm just connecting the dots here, and it does sort of make sense to me.
Yeah, and I think like the other thing around people with diet dogma is if there's like neuroinflammation because they're so stressed about like
Mm.
what they need to eat or something, that within itself is going to increase sympathetic activity and decrease vagal tone. And what that essentially does is it slows down motility, as we said before at the start of this podcast, that will allow for high levels of fermentation to allow for bacteria to essentially thrive, like pathogenic strains. So I think it goes on that level as well that like stress, again, stress and fear lowers mitochondrial metabolism in terms of how we regulate oxygen. Sympathetic nervous system kicks in, motility slows down, and then on top of that, like locally in the gut, like we rely on oxygen there as well along our gut lining for certain cells. For example, like parietal cells. I was just researching it today that 30 to 40% of that cell that spits out stomach acid and intrinsic factor is 30 to 40% is mitochondrial weight of its actual cell type. And it makes a lot of sense because of the pumps that are operating there. So we've got to think like there's many mechanisms at play that are going to compromise what's going on. But I think at the end of the day, it's still just we can look at it on so many layers. We can look at it from like the neurotransmitter level, the hormone level, the toxin level, the gut microbiome level. But I think ultimately what is causing disease these days is that it's just inflammation and poor redox. And when I say redox, I'm talking about like reduction and oxidation and how well we can handle that, which again just ties in with this whole story that we've been spitting out this whole podcast.
Yeah, redox is such a huge topic, and we talk about grounding and EMFs and how they affect our like oxidation and reduction reactions. And this sort of ties back into what I was saying about again, like another example of how centralized education they teach you about the photoelectric effect. They teach you about like the magnetism of the earth. But then when you say, okay, well then grounding might be good for you because you're absorbing electrons from the earth to improve your redox, they look at you like you're crazy. It's like so like, yeah, let's talk a bit about grounding and how grounding affects our redox and why it might be beneficial.
Yeah, so the Earth has a net negative charge. So what that essentially means is that there's more electrons. That there's a high electron density uh, being, right? Sorry if my internet's unstable. Let me know
That's
if
fine,
you have
yeah.
any issues and I can
It's just a bit laggy, but it's just it was fine for the most part.
repeat back. It's sort of a bit Filipino internet.
Yeah.
Like we provide on the Earth. Is it?
Right. Let's just start again
Hang on
with
one sec.
grounding
Do you need me
because
to move?
I think it was just a bit laggy for a
Okay.
bit, but if we talk a bit about grounding, if we just start that again.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So as I said with grounding, with like the Earth, it has a net negative charge. So that essentially means it has a high density of electrons that we can plug into. And we've got to think like ancestrally, we were designed because we have sweat glands on our feet and our hands, and we weren't wearing rubber soled shoes, because again, that's something that's a somewhat new invention as well. We were able to plug into the Earth. And what it essentially does is that these electrons run through our semiconductors, predominantly like our fascia, which is water and collagen networks that span throughout our whole body. And also feed into like our cytoskeleton where microtubules are found, and they can essentially be used for redox-based reactions. So, again, like if we need an electron to reduce something like, say, as an example here, like superoxide, we have the ability to do that because we've got a spare electron at play. So that's the main reasoning behind that. But I will say like there's other reasons for grounding as well. And I would say the other thing is like if we have more electrons coming into the system, you mentioned the photoelectric effect, and I think that's really important to address because what that fundamentally encompasses, which is what Einstein found out, is that photons only interact with electrons. So when we're talking about this whole light story, we need a high density of electrons to allow all this magic to happen. And when we plug into the Earth, we're essentially allowing that to happen. And it makes plenty of sense because when you're outside, you're grounded and you can get sunlight. And it could be indirect as well with infrared light. And like, for example, I mean, you can't really see them. There's beautiful plants and
Mhm.
trees nearby, and they're reflecting infrared as well. So it's just going to increase your bang for your buck in terms of sunlight utilization, basically, and harnessing like the energy from sunlight. And then I would say the other thing as well, there's some pretty cool research in terms of grounding is also a way that we control our circadian biology. So like our clocks to literally govern our like the timing of our cells and our tissues on that circadian level, which again is like running on that 24-hour cycle. It's playing a role, just like this research around that, like without any other stimulus. So again, of course, like light and dark is obviously the biggest influence here, but then you got like exercise, you got um what's the other one that I was thinking of? Feeding time as well. They're all going to have an influence as well around circadian behavior, but grounding within itself, without those, is still going to influence like the timing of your biology, which is obviously crucial because we want things turned on at the right times. We don't want digestion to just like run all night or our adrenal glands to kick in in the middle of the night. So you want that functional and it's in harmony. And then the other thing on top of that is like the when you ground, you're going to yoke yourself to like the Earth's magnetic field as well, which is going to have a bunch of benefits around the whole magnetic side of things. Where, well, one of the main things is with what goes on the mitochondrial electron transport chain again. So those complexes, magnetism enhances the tunneling and proton and electron tunneling there. And we've got to think, well, if we're enhancing that on top of getting sunlight, grounding, we're getting these electrons. It's going to essentially like just optimize that system to a T where that uh, 3 miles per gallon car turns into a 100 miles per gallon car or 1,000 miles per gallon car, whatever it is. So that's the reasoning behind grounding being super good in terms of all of that, basically. And again, it's just influencing by energetics.
No, I mean 100%. Grounding's such it's such a simple thing to do as well. It's like just put your feet on the grass, like en enhance your redox. But on the topic of magnetism, because I saw you, I remember a tweet you posted about how you said that like there are quantum effects of living near a waterfall and also quantum effects of living near a volcano. And you said that that was due to like the magnetism and the negative ions. And at the time, I didn't really understand like the whole science behind it. It's like, what would like if we break down what are the effects of living near like a volcano or waterfall and these like magnetic effects that they produce?
So the waterfall isn't as much of a magnetic effect as it is like a negative ion effect. So that's called like the Leonard effect, where the waterfall, just because of the nature of what it does, the water that falls, it essentially drives like negative ions into the atmosphere. And then essentially we can absorb them. So you got to think if we're doing that plus grounding, we're getting this provided with this negative charge, which is going to be really beneficial. And then I think you mentioned volcanoes, which is interesting because there's a volcano erupting here in the Philippines right now, up in Luzon, which is where Manila is, which is the capital. And we're getting like knock-on effects here. You may have seen it on the news in terms of like the earthquakes here. I think it was like a
Mhm.
6.9 earthquake. Um, there was, I think, where we were on this island, it was like a 4.8 or something like that. And it was happening throughout the night. And I honestly, I didn't even wake up to it because I think it's just like that is what enhances sleep. Like nights aren't as much about like electric fields and sunlight, but more so about magnetic fields. And I think the electromagnetic pollution that we're bathed in puts downward pressure on that system where we can't use like the magnetic effects within our mitochondria properly or within our water networks. Because we got to remember as well that water is a dipole molecule where it has a north and south pole, so it aligns them more coherently. Which again, tying in with what water does, it's a pretty big deal. So yeah, living near volcanoes, I mean, like the benefit of where I am, I suppose, is that I'm getting strong tropical sunlight and volcanic activity. So the other thing that I forgot to mention though is like North and South Pole. So the further you go up to a North or South Pole, you're going to have higher um, magnetic flux because of the nature of like again, if we talk about water having a North and South Pole, the Earth does as well. So the more you go to a higher latitude, the more of that magnetic effect, and the more you're at a latitude like me, for example, at the ninth, there's less of that. But when you're near a volcano, you're also getting that magnetic pulse, especially when there's like it's erupting because there's just tectonic plates and they're constantly moving and they're enhancing that magnetic flux in that region, despite it being so far from one of the poles. So, yeah, there's pretty huge benefits in terms of that. And I think I just mentioned all the magnetism stuff prior, but yeah, like to be able to get strong UV, and then of course you're going to get strong infrared light here as well because of the heat. You're going to get thunderstorms and rain. So essentially, like you can ground and you're going to yoke yourself to the human resonance more coherently, on top of everything else that grounding, the benefits of grounding that I mentioned before. So there's huge potential here. And then you throw in like the whole volcanic activity on top. It's just really cool to tie in what goes on with nature. And I think that's why we gravitated towards mountains or like these beautiful environments where there's lots of lush nature nearby because we notice the effects. And I think that's probably why, like places like the Philippines, Mexico, Peru, they're deeply spiritual. Like they're really spiritual people. And I think these environments, like where I am right now, it just calls for huge spiritual potential, really, just because of all the inputs that you're receiving. You become more coherent within yourself, and I think that's where you unlock that spiritual health. I would say beyond just like physical and mental health.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, yeah, living near a volcano does sound pretty sick, to be honest. Um, so would you?
As well. Like to see just like a volcano, I don't know what it is. Like I love seeing like beautiful jungles and mountains, but to see like a perfectly shaped volcano, it is just like one of the most magnificent things that you can see in nature. Sorry for cutting you off there, but yeah, it's just like it's a really beautiful thing. I don't know if you've ever been to a country where you see volcanoes, like Iceland's not too far from you. Then you got Latin America as well, Italy. Like you just see it and you just feel different there. I think it's a very healing place to be around.
Well, I'm in Scotland right now, and there's actually a volcano next to my place, but it's been extinct for like 300 million years, so it doesn't really count, does it?
Well, it's still going to be like it's classified as inactive, but there's still going to be like some activity of the tectonic plates under there. I suppose like in Scotland, it's probably if you've ever looked at like the how the I suppose the ring of fire of like the Earth, where like the volcanic activity sort of intersects between tectonic plates. Normally, you're going to see like New Zealand feed up into Indonesia, then you got the Philippines trench, then you got Japan, and then kind of loops back around through Alaska all the way down. And then I suppose that you've got other regions as well, like Italy and Iceland. So I would say that it's probably got a deep connection in terms of the tectonic activity in the plates in Iceland. So you're still going to get some sort of benefit there, I would say. And then on top of that, you've got to remember that Scotland's like 55th latitude or something like that as well. So you're obviously getting like a deeper benefit around magnetic flux, cold exposure. And again, like with these things, it's just like coming back to what is available um, in your natural environment. So I don't get cold here unless it fucking rains heavily and I'm driving a scooter and I have a t-shirt on because I didn't realize that it was going to rain and I had no poncho. But for you, it's like you have this huge potential of embracing the cold and having those other inputs that will shape your biology in a beneficial fashion. And I think like in the modern world, we're sitting behind heaters, we're not going outside, we're scared of the sun. So there's just no wonder why we feel like shit and why we're sick.
Yeah, I mean, the whole volcano Scotland thing's interesting. I guess that would be back when like Pangea was a thing. But I mean, my knowledge of geological history isn't that great. But so would you say the biggest difference between like the northern latitudes versus like the equatorial regions are the variations in magnetic flux and UV? Are those the two biggest the two biggest differences?
Yeah, and then on top of that, right, like you've got the cold exposure, and the cold exposure within itself upregulates mitochondrial biogenesis and metabolism. So you're going to get this influx of UV biophotons potentially, which is going to somewhat replace the light that we get, where I am versus where you are. And on top of that, like cold within itself enhances semiconduction. So we've got that benefit where you've got this magnetic effect, you've got the cold exposure and the cooling of your surfaces, which enhances how electrons move through these structures, whether it's like melanin, whether it's water, whatever it is. There's just a higher level of efficiency there. And this so again, I think just like nature works in feedback loops. It's same for like vitamin D when it's scarce where you are. You've got access to cod liver oil, you've got access to salmon that is going to
Mhm.
contain vitamin D. So I think you can thrive wherever, and there is different inputs wherever you are. And I suppose like the other thing, right? Like you can really change your environment if you go to somewhere that's got a mountain and you just climb up there and you're getting UVA and potentially UVB light because you're biohacking your local environment. So I just think like yeah, there's differences like differences in food, differences in terms of like the deuterium levels in water versus like where I am. It's probably significantly higher, probably like 10 to 15 parts per million higher where I am versus where you are. But again, like if you're exposing yourself to nature and healing, you're giving yourself the right inputs where everything just works in this beautiful feedback loop. And it's only when we start taking steps out of that. And again, there's resilience there. Like there's still resilience around, you eating like a mango or papaya where you live. But you just have to understand and differentiate when you can get away with it. And I suppose like the more you're connecting to nature, um, in every way, shape, or form, and like copying nature, I suppose, the more that like you have that resilience, but because you are doing the right thing majority of the time.
Yeah, I've always like during summer in Scotland, it is really sunny. So I'm like, I'll just eat as much fruit as I want. Like, even if it's important, I'm still getting enough UV to deplete the deuterium. But now that it's October, I'm like slowly weaning off of it. And then during the winter, I guess it's just like a low deuterium diet, which brings me to a tangent. But would you say that like dried fruits like apricots, raisins, dates, prunes, they because if they're dry, do they like does that mean they've sucked out all of their water and because I know like when you dry a fruit, you're getting rid of their like lighter isotopes of hydrogen. So does that mean they're higher in deuterium? And if so, like how do we navigate that in cold exposure? Because I've heard like Andra, she's talked about how like it doesn't make sense to be completely carnivore in winter in the northern latitude. Like she still incorporates dried fruits like apricots and raisins and whatever. So how do you see that?
Yeah. So to answer your question, like, does it do that? So like, yeah, it does because of how deuterium fractionation works with heat, and that's literally why the more that occurs, the more that deuterium will stay. Like, so for example, where I am, the maybe I've got this wrong. I get a bit confused with it, but I've got like a whole webinar that
Mhm.
I spoke about it. But yeah, the fractionation of what you're talking about here is that deuterium will stay in it because hydrogen is lighter, and that's essentially what happens where I am, where the heat will essentially pull out the lighter hydrogen isotopes into the clouds, and then the nature of clouds it cycles up and like south and north, and then it rains, and then there's less, and then it kind of repeats that cycle. And what happens where with in the case of what's going on with your like with, around the dried fruit is that yeah, there would be higher levels of deuterium. Now, the next question to follow up on that is like, should you be concerned about that? That would be the next question. And this is where I think looking into blood work and symptoms and everything down the line, that's where you'd get your definitive answer in terms of if it should be problematic or not. And to be honest with you, I've definitely changed my mind around deuterium. Um, I think it's blown out of proportion in terms of like being concerned about collagen supplements and carbohydrates in the winter. Um, I think our body, when we're healthy, we have these regulatory effects. Like we should be able to poop out the deuterium. Our gut microbiome actually helps make us hydrogen that's deuterium depleted as well. Um, we need deuterium in the right amounts, and I think, yeah, I would say it's just if you're healthy, you can get away with a lot. And I think like this is the p people can get a bit neurotic around certain interventions and like certain things that they can and can't do. And I would say again, it ties in with like the supplements and being high in deuterium. But ultimately, it's like it's making the assessment for yourself, what your level of health is. Can you get away with it? Um, for the most part, I would say it's absolutely fine. I just think like when I would restrict deuterium, and when I'm talking about dried fruits, it's not just for the deuterium, but it's also because of the glucose as well, where you're getting a decent amount of glucose in there. And if someone's got high insulin on a blood test or high HbA1c, I'd be more reluctant to say, hey, maybe we should prioritize something else. Maybe it's a starch instead. Maybe again, like maybe there's gut issues that like that maybe there's yeast or bacterial issues that could be feeding on whatever dried fruit it fundamentally is. So I think there's just like that's a good question, but then we have to elaborate on it and figure out like is it applicable for someone? And just to circle back to deuterium, the only times that I will recommend not taking it is honestly when people have cancer. I think that's probably the perfect time to like remove it because there's decent research with deuterium depleted water being effective around cancer. But and not much else to tell you the truth. I would suppose like the only other thing is like I like ketogenic diets for people with neuropsychiatric disorders, schizophrenia, epilepsy, all of these conditions. But it's not just because of the deuterium as well. It could be because of a number of things, like beyond just deuterium. It could be its effect on regulating glucose, which again will funnel into those energetic pathways we mentioned before. Optimizing insulin signaling, ketones being a different energy source, where again they like beta hydroxybutyrate is a histone deacetylase inhibitor, which are going to have beneficial effects with like epigenetic programming. So yeah, I think that whole deuterium thing, I only really consider it around certain aspects, as I mentioned before. And for the most part, I mean, like just looking at you, if you're asking personally for you, if I just had to make the assumption
Mhm.
right here, right now, I would have absolutely no problems with you having occasional dry fruits and raw honey and like carbs in the winter months. I think there's a bit of like dogma around that as well, as we said before, like circling back to the start of this conversation, that I think there's a lot of dogma around fear mongering deuterium and you have to have this really seasonal diet. But yeah, and there's truth to that. But like you can get raw honey whenever, you can get oats, you can get wheat. So I think there just needs to be context involved around all of that as well.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it does make sense to me that like when it comes to deuterium, when it comes to parasites, germs, heavy metals, mold, like none of them are actually the root cause. It's like it comes down to your body's ability to handle it and excrete it. So yeah, I've never really thought of deuterium in that like category as like not the root cause, but like if if you're struggling to metabolize deuterium, it's more of a you problem than it is like a deuterium problem. Same with like parasites, heavy metals, mold. And this gets into like germ theory versus terrain theory, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And yeah, when it comes to people fear mongering deuterium and supplements, I saw that response you made to Young King Naito. It was like 1 minute, like you actually did the maths and you said like best like even in the worst case scenario, even if 1 milligram of melatonin has all of its hydrogen atoms as deuterium, it's like it's still less deuterium you'd get from like a tablespoon of coconut oil. And yeah, that was pretty cool because like obviously as a chemistry student, I'm familiar with like mole calculations and like molar mass and all that, so I thought that was quite cool. But yeah, like you see people talk about how like collagen's got deuterium, supplements of deuterium, you should avoid it. But when you actually break it down and do the maths like you have, yeah, like you'll find out that there's actually less deuterium in like the worst case scenario of 1 milligram of melatonin than there is in like a teaspoon of coconut oil.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just doing the maths and the reality of like having a melatonin supplement that's completely deuterated is literally it's literally impossible because of how much more abundant protons like or protium is compared to deuterium. So that's the nuance around that. And I was going to say something else about deuterium now, but I've forgotten. Yeah, sorry, I forgot. But yeah,
Nah, that's fine.
I think we summarized that all pretty well anyway, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I mean, and then another question I had was we talked a bit about how like obviously there's variations depending on your latitude, but what about altitude? Like, because I've seen a lot of people talk about, say, if you live like on a mountain, you're gonna have what like less magnetism or something about you're gonna be hypoxic if you go on a hike, so take methylene blue. Like how does our altitude actually affect us?
So with altitude, um, and I believe it's every 300 meters, we get like this. I want to say it's like a 5 to 10% rise in UV exposure or levels. So that's why like places like Peru, for example, Cusco, which is a place I've been to, has the strongest UV as a city on the planet because it's at the seventh latitude, about 3,500 meters above sea level. And what the changes are around altitude is you have obviously like differences in oxygen tensions, but I think like the whole idea around methylene blue or thiamine or cordyceps or any of these interventions, which are kind of cool for being at a high altitude, it's more so like a to adapt to that level. Because remember, like these people, like Peruvians, as an example, where like when I was there, all of them are like walking upstairs or something or walking, and they're doing okay. And then like myself and my ex-girlfriend at the time, like we were just absolutely tanked. Yeah, so it's more about the adaptation process, which takes anywhere between like 3 to 4 days, maybe a little bit longer. And that's how we adapt to that by increasing bicarbonate in our kidneys to yoke to the oxygen tensions. And we've got to remember that bicarbonate a form is like a form of carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide allows for oxygen release. So the higher we have this retention of CO2, we allow for more oxygen release to compensate for the lack of oxygen being present in the environment. Um, and this is exactly why, like athletes who do high altitude training, it's actually really beneficial because of its effect on retainment of CO2. So you have a better ability of doing that. So your performance can be more enhanced because you can use oxygen better at um, at the mitochondrial level. So the main difference around altitude is definitely like UV light, cold, and what was the other one? UV light, cold, and oxygen tensions. So, but as I said before, like everything just works in a feedback loop, where you have you may have stronger UV, but it's also cold. And I would even say that like being at a high altitude is probably I would say it's like one of the most beneficial things you could do for your health. I literally just got told the other day by the woman who manages the place that we're at that there is a woman here, like a Filipino woman that lives in the mountains in Luzon, and she's a tattoo artist and she's like 103 years old. And to get a tattoo from her, she does like stick and poke tattoos. You have to walk to her house in the mountains to actually do it. And I think like that within itself says a lot that like, yeah, I think like the environment of like a whole high altitude where it's slightly cold, you get stronger UV, you'll have higher CO2 retention by design. It provides potential for longevity. And I think even Ray Peat has even spoken about this as well, that there is decent benefits from living at a high altitude. And I think that's exactly why. And I would say that like the best place to be, as I said before, is just like if you can live somewhere that has volcanic activity, it's got decent light stability. So somewhere between 25 north and 25 south. I think I mentioned the high altitude. But then also like having access to like an ocean and like going down there to an ocean to get fresh seafood and being able to sort of have both the best of both worlds. I would say that would be the most healing place on the planet. And I think that's what you see with a lot of cities is like they're built around mountains and ocean, like for
Hmm,
the most part. And I think ancestrally we knew how beneficial it was to be around that.
that's really interesting. The CO2 part's interesting too, because I think the mainstream view is that carbon dioxide's just a waste product. But then, like Ray P and like Aesthetic Primal, they've talked about how, yeah, like CO2 is our body's main vasodilator, like in our blood vessels, instead of nitric oxide. So I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah, you got that.
Mhm.
And then also you got carboxylase enzymes, which feeds into the urea cycle. So and its utilization. Can you hear me? I think the internet became
Oh,
unstable again.
it just cut off a bit, but you were talking about carboxylates and CO2.
Yeah, so there's a carboxylase enzyme that kickstarts the urea cycle. And so that within itself is like understanding that oxygen is playing, carbon dioxide is playing a big role in terms of regulating the deuterium levels in the body. It also just, again, ties in with this whole energetic system where there's protons, deuterium, carbon dioxide, nitric oxide, oxygen, electrons, photons. Like it's all this system in terms of like how well we can funnel mitochondrial metabolism, really. And as we said before, like the Krebs cycle, the TCA cycle, ties exactly in with the urea cycle and intersects with like deuterium levels. So that's another interesting effect as well. But yeah, I would say like the carbon dioxide is a vasodilator. I would say like it works in synergism with nitric oxide, and then nitric oxide and carbon dioxide work together to for the ability to transport oxygen and release it properly. And we've got to think, well, UV light plays a big role in terms of stimulating endothelial nitric oxide synthase to make nitric oxide within itself, which is obviously really beneficial. Unless you support Ray Pete around that, which again, I think there's lots of nuance to that. But then on top of it, you've got carbon dioxide, which is key for like the release of oxygen as well. So, and this ties in with like breathing mechanics and how well we're breathing, which again, like if we circle back to our ability to utilize oxygen, we're trying to create a system. So again, like hunched over shoulders, chest breathing, mouth breathing, not breathing through our nose, which again doesn't increase nitric oxide, it doesn't increase carbon dioxide. So we're yoking it to how well we're using oxygen. So the more that we get out into a system where we can increase carbon dioxide and nitric oxide. So again, like that environment where we've got strong UV light up in the mountains and retainment of carbon dioxide or bicarbonate in the kidneys, we're creating this environment that we can use oxygen properly again. Right. So really, really cool. And then I haven't even mentioned the cold exposure on top of that. But yeah, it just creates like a very powerful place to heal. And I think that's why a lot of retreats and everything else is on top of that is exactly why they're in the mountains, because it's just a very healing place to be. On top of that, like you're surrounded by nature, you got low EMFs on top. So yeah, I just think it's a pretty cool thing to consider.
Yeah, Jack, I can see it's getting late, so I don't want to keep you too long, but um, I just do have one last sort of topic, like one last question. Um,
Yeah.
you brought up earlier how people who live in equatorial regions tend to be a bit more spiritual, whether it's um like ayahuasca, plant medicine, psychedelics, nootropics. How have you found like that to affect our biology? Do you think they're beneficial, or does it just depend on like where you are in the world, your context? Like if we talk about psychedelics, nootropics, I guess that would include like yeah, ayahuasca, magic mushrooms. How do you see those impacting our biology?
So if you look at the structures of any of those, you're going to see they all have like this aromatic ring attached to them. And when you see aromatic ring, you automatically know that they're going to be light absorbing and light emitting molecules. And we don't just see it with, I don't know what happened. I don't know
Yeah,
if it was probably my internet, I assume. I thought there was a brownout, but yeah, I don't know what happened there. But
no worries.
um, you asked about, so I don't know where I got cut off there.
You said that psychedelics, nootropics, magic mushrooms, they've all got an aromatic ring that absorbs light.
Yes. So, and then on top of that, like we didn't even mention it, but supplements such as like curcumin, resveratrol, methylene blue, like all of these have unique absorption and fluorescent levels. And this is why I think like certain supplements work so well under certain circumstances. And I didn't even really mention this, but like in terms of like if we're able to figure out light emissions within the cell and kind of yoke it like with AI in terms of like supplements and what they absorb, what they emit, how they synergize together, I think you're going to find some pretty interesting data and it's going to be really useful in terms of people healing from chronic diseases. But around the question with psychedelics and nootropics, so we start with psychedelics with those aromatic rings. What I think is going on with them um, is that because they all interact with UV light, I think it's bringing deep levels of UV light into the system beyond of like its interactions on a neurochemical level. So, for example, like dimethyltryptamine, DMT, um, psilocybin. Sorry, my window just exited.
That's fine.
Psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, like all of these interact, for example, with like serotonin receptors predominantly. Um, which is interesting, but I'm just not convinced that that's enough to drive such psychoactive experiences from some of these compounds. So I think what is going on, and like again, there's no real deep evidence around this, but my suspicions is that we're driving deep UV light into the system that is essentially altering the way neural circuits work, energy flow to create this false, well, not false, but this altered sense of reality, and our the way we perceive our environment when we're taking these compounds to essentially shift our behaviors, our outlooks on life, and then essentially unlocking that spiritual level that some people may get from just optimal health. So again, like I would say, I used to take some of these things when I wasn't healthy, and I would say now, like even though I don't get like the deep hallucinations and things of that nature, I think I'm just more spiritually connected now, and I have get this deep love for life and nature and the earth, right? So I think it can be like a needle mover in terms of people, and I think this is why you see like a lot of Americans, like they call it like ayahuasca
Mm.
syndrome or something like that, where like people go there and they just constantly take ayahuasca, and they're thinking that they're like leveling up and they have like this, sense of self-entitlement. But realistically, what they're doing is maybe they're just trying to essentially get to a system of like of achieving health and like trying to find answers to certain things where realistically the answers can be found by just like achieving optimal health and just being spiritually open. Now, the flip side of that is that if you're healthy and you use psychedelics or nootropics, that they're going to have a just an enhancement effect. So I think this is why you see like certain shamans or very spiritually grounded people that they do these things and they have the most beautiful experiences, and maybe they understand life and the world a bit more in depth, the universe. And I think that's where it can be really useful. Where yeah, and what essentially is going on, I think there's just like these deep interactions with UV light interacting with chromophores and semiconductors in the body, beyond what's going on a neurochemical level. And the thing with nootropics, again, like they all have nootropics or any sort of herbs. A lot of them have the same unique aromatic ring structure. So you just know that there's on that biophysical level, there's interactions with light going on. Um, and even the same for like pharmaceutical drugs, certain pharmaceutical drugs, even things such as like methamphetamine, like street drugs as well. They all seem to have like these unique structures where they interact with light. And ultimately, I think it's just like depending on what the wavelength it is, and it could be the difference of like 240 versus like 250, that's going to have different impacts on your biology. And this is like the level I would love to get to in terms of just like learning or having a database of understanding all the absorption and emission spectras of every single molecule that exists, whether it's exogenous or endogenously made. And when we get to that stage of being able to measure light inside our cells and figuring out what's going on, the whole AI system is essentially going to be able to reverse engineer what someone fundamentally needs. And I think that's going to be like the future of medicine. I mean, I don't think it is. I mean, I just think that should be the future of medicine, is what I should say. Because that is going to provide a lot of answers. And if I like circling back to Roland Van Wyk, he had like an article on it. He spoke about biophotons, and he said that like we could detect patterns of like disease from biophotons before symptoms or lab work even arises, and that's what really tweaked my interest around all of these things. And I think that's why certain compounds like psychedelics can be healing for some people, but not so healing for others, and could be in fact detrimental. And some people could even enter psychosis, is because maybe they don't need that light. Maybe they need a different wavelength. And again, these are all like the unknowns, but this is sort of where I'm at in terms of what I would like to research next around all this stuff, because I think that is very much the future of healing.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I didn't realize the connection between the aromatic rings and all of these different compounds in these drugs. But yeah, I think a lot of people they use like ayahuasca or magic mushroom psilocybin as a way to achieve like spiritual enlightenment. But I think when you find that through, say, like I'm a Christian, so for me it comes from God, but when you get that through religion or optimal health, like you're not spiritually broken anymore. You're not searching for like an answer in the form of ayahuasca or magic mushrooms.
Yeah, you're just high on life basically. And you see this in the Philippines where I would say like if you look into like Filipino history, they're very much like their religion is literally like the connection to nature. I can't remember what it's called. I think it's called like Addism or something like that. And I mean, it's a bit different to what you see in Mexico and Peru, where you
Mhm.
got ayahuasca growing in abundance. You've even got a fucking toad in Mexico called like the Colorado toad or something, where it literally has 5-MeO-DMT on it, which is like a very aggressive, potent form of dimethyltryptamine that is supposedly meant to have the most intense trips ever. I mean, I think like Joe Rogan's spoken about it. I've had a friend who's taken it and he said it was like the most craziest thing he's ever experienced. Like he just can't explain it. Um, and yeah, like I mean, here there's no real psychedelics that enhance the experience. It just seems like a lot of people here are spiritually in tune. And I think what adds to that is that the Philippines, much like other regions of Latin America, it just calls for spiritual potential because of the volcanic activity, because of the tropical sunlight, because of the lushness of the nature here, the jungles, the mountains, the ocean. So I think that again, like if we kind of summarize that, like it's just the connection to nature enhances that experience where and when people like when I say spiritual, like we're not just talking about like hallucinations and fucking, like having this like enlightenment around that, but like when you have like this spirit, like this spiritual health intact, I just feel like your passion towards life, or just anything you do, your purpose in life, um, all of that is just significantly amplified, and your connection to like God and the higher power is enhanced, and everything just gets rolled out to you on a red carpet, and you're just like, okay, I know exactly what I need to do here. Like you get synchronicities, you maybe you see a certain color or you see an animal that's symbolic. And I think that's what spirituality sort of encompasses. And as I said before, like taking a certain herb to enhance the experience can be a blessing, but it also can be a curse. And obviously that's why you see people who have bad psychedelic trips because they're not ready for it. Maybe they're taking it in an apartment in New York City versus taking it in nature, how it's intended to be. And that's why you probably see deeper, darker things, because it's not used how it should be, and it's not used with respect that it deserves. And I know that we only spoke about psychedelics here, but like, I suppose nootropics and supplements have their place around other things as well. But they all have, of course, like very broad in terms of like, what each thing can potentially do.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I've never done any psychedelics or mushrooms or nootropics, but I don't like I don't think it would benefit me in that way. But I think for a lot of people there would be like actual health benefits. I just don't think people should use it for the spiritual benefits.
Yeah, I sort of sit on the fence. It just depends, again, sort of just depends on the individual, depends on their journey, depends on what their goals are, what they want to get out of it. Um, yeah, it depends on the person, I suppose. I'm sitting with you. I think for me personally, I don't see myself taking psychedelics anytime soon. Maybe something in the future, I'd be open to experimenting with something like ayahuasca or DMT, but it's not something that's like I'm ready for, or I have like the drive to do, right? It's like maybe if I get put into a certain situation where I have the opportunity to do it and I'm ready for it, maybe I will do it and maybe I will experiment. But yeah, in saying that, like I have played around like in the past, but I wasn't healthy, and I don't think I had the greatest experiences. I think it's just like I just laughed a lot. I was taking other drugs at the same time. Maybe I saw like weird colors and weird shit happening. Maybe I was a bit paranoid, but I don't think that's what psychedelics should encompass. It should be about going deeper within yourself, maybe unlocking another level. But again, like it's doing it in context with, are you ready to take it? Because as we know, it is a double-edged sword. It can sometimes do more harm than good. And it's important to differentiate that for the individual, where they're at around that.
Yeah, that's 100%. I mean, it just depends on the person, but yeah, Jack, this was a really good conversation we had. Like, it was such a privilege to have you on and talk about all of these esoteric topics, but also like help people implement it into their lives and improve their health. And yeah, so Where can people find you to work with you?
Yeah, so thanks for having me, man. It was a really fun conversation. Definitely went deeper than what I normally do, and I think that's just the nature of two people who want to talk about biochemistry and biophysics and understanding the mechanisms behind everything. Because I think we're very much the same around that. But people can find me on X and Instagram. So Instagram is Jack Schroder underscore, X is Jack underscore Schroder underscore. That's where you're going to find like a decent amount of content, to be honest. And then for further exposure, I've got Substack, which is just going to have protocols, and then I've got my school community, which you're in, and I'm sure you can vouch for the value
Yeah.
in there, where um, there are many webinars for learning. There's over 80 protocols. There's daily blogs. There's live Q&As that are starting to occur weekly now. So that's an opportunity to pick my brain or just talk about whether it's health issues that need to be addressed, or even just from a mentoring perspective as well. It seems to be that is the niche of like helping people with significant health issues and they can't find the answers, as we said before, because there's information overload. They don't know exactly what to do. But then also people who just are really wanting to learn, like yourself, where you're wanting to become a practitioner yourself and understand all the cogs and gears. So it's catering for those two people. There's also like health journals in there and learning journals where I respond every 24 hours. So that's the value. To be honest, the value for that is pretty insane. And that's why like within the next few months I will be raising the prices on that. So for anyone who does join when they hear this, on 4th of October 2025, or any probably within a few months, just be sure to join because you'll be locked in at the price that it's displayed at before it raises. So that's like the main place to find me. But then if you want even deeper, that's where I do like I take on one or two clients a month doing either mentorships or health optimization coaching. And usually it is going to be people from the school community, but then occasionally there's someone who just wants to reach out and just go really deep. And yeah, that's an opportunity. If you qualify for my services, then that's definitely the place to go to if you want to go incredibly in depth and just go, yeah, just fast track everything as much as you can. So yeah, that school community is called Health Optimization, and then the Substack, I think it's called Decentralized Health Optimization. I need to change that to Health Optimization to kind of match it, but that's where you can find me. And then jackschroder.com as well is where you're going to find basically everything that I just mentioned anyway. So if you just go straight to that website, you'll find absolutely everything, my testimonials, podcasts, and so on.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you guys next time. If you enjoyed that episode of the Ancestral Cure podcast, please give it a like, give it a comment, and share it to your friends. Your support means so much to me here, and thank you all for listening.